and start. Recording this for our Data4Democracy gerrymandering group. And Professor Sam Wang and his colleague Brian have been able to join us here. So let's just go ahead and get started. Sam, can you tell us a little bit about your background and why particularly did you get into looking at gerrymandering?
Sure, glad to. Let me try to be brief about this. I'm a professor at Princeton, and my domain is neuroscience and statistical analysis, and that's really what I do in my teaching and my research. But in addition to that, I do polling analysis and election analysis, and I do that at the Princeton Election Consortium. So I came into the question of gerrymandering because I made a wrong prediction in 2012, and I wanted to understand what the heck happened. In 2012, I made a correct prediction, which is that based on polling data, which usually in most years does pretty well, that the Democrats in the House of Representatives at a nationwide level would win the popular vote. And indeed they did. They won over about 1.3 million more votes than Republicans in congressional races. But I made a wrong prediction, which is that I also predicted that therefore they would regain control of the House. And that did not happen. The House stayed in Republican hands. And I was ticked off about making a wrong prediction. I just wanted to know why that was. And I looked into it, and I discovered several things about the way districts are drawn. And it reminded me of a fact that probably most citizens ought to know, which is that congressional districts are typically drawn by legislators, and so therefore legislators are in charge of themselves in some sense. I mean, it's state legislators and it's congressional representatives, but there is a sense in which legislators pick their voters and it's not voters picking their legislators. And so there's this loophole in how our democracy works. So that's the first thing. The second thing I noticed was by doing some calculations, I figured out that that in addition to natural patterns of population, there's a new player on the scene, which is playing for partisan advantage. And partisan advantages had led to a distortion in representation of something like about 15 seats, 10 to 15 seats. And that this was a distortion that was concentrated in states where there was single party control over drawing districts. States like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan, those are all under Republican control, but also states under Democratic control like Maryland and Illinois. And the net effect was to make something like close to 100 seats nationwide not competitive, either by taking the legislators taking their opponents and jamming them, packing them into a few districts so that they would be guaranteed winners on their side, but only a few, or these legislators taking their own partisans and spreading them real thin, right? Like peanut butter on a piece of toast or something like that, just real thin layer to get smaller wins for their own side. But what it meant was that voters in all districts on both sides were deprived of the chance to have competitive races where the legislators would have to fight for their seats. And so I figured this out. I wrote it up in a piece that was in the New York Times that year. And there's a piece I wrote in the New York Times in 2013 called The Great Gerrymander of 2012. And people can look up that article, The Great Gerrymander of 2012. And I've written about it since then, again in the New York Times, in an article called Let Math Save Our Democracy. So having diagnosed it, now the thing I'm super interested in is developing standards to help both activists and judges identify partisan gerrymandering and remedy the error. And so I've undertaken a project over the next few years. Brian Remlinger here has joined up and is on the team. And we together are trying to come up with standards that courts can use to say, okay, here's a standard for gerrymandering. We apply it. This state fails the test. Zip, zip, zip. Go back and try again, Mr. and Ms. Legislator. And so the idea is to come up with standards that do that. Activists can, we hope, devise rules, and there are obvious intuitions that activists have about how to do this fairly. It turns out that a lot of those intuitions are probably wrong, or will not lead to outcomes that the activists want. And so one project at the level of activism is to help them think of ways to make their desires stick, to make races competitive, and to not leave loopholes. Anyway, so the gerrymander site is a way to collect all that information, including some surprisingly simple statistics. And so what we're aiming to do here is to create a resource where we can work with judges, work with lawyers, work with activists to level the playing field a little bit and to put legislators back under the control of voters.
That sounds great. And I'm really, and I think I speak for the whole group. We're really excited to work on this project. So it sounds like to me, your number one kind of customer is judges and lawyers. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say right now it's judges and lawyers. Roughly speaking, I view this as a several-year project where right now the Supreme Court seems amenable. There are 5 votes on the Supreme Court. One of those 5 is Anthony Kennedy, and there's a clock running on that where as long as those 5 votes are available, there's a possibility of getting action at the court level. So I'd say in the next year or two, that's a super hot, red hot issue. Right behind it is how to help activists. And I think that's important too. It's just that I would say that right now what we're trying to do is we're trying to rev up our war machine for our communication machine for dealing with judges and lawyers in order to help them out. But activists come soon afterwards. As I said, I just went to a recent redistricting conference that Common Cause put together, and there were both lawyers and activists there. And I was really struck by how much energy there was on the activist side. And so I think on the timescale of a year or two, we definitely want to loop in those men and women and help them out. But yes.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. So I mean, just trying to kind of hash out a little bit of, who we're focused on, that really helps the lawyers and judges, because I think, that can drive some design decisions about the website.
To appeal to them.
What's that?
You mean to make sense and appeal to them?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And,
one consequence, for instance, is they're not mathematicians.
Yes.
Right? Like lawyers don't choose law because they love math. Like you could be a coder who's coding because you love math, but nobody chooses law because they love math.
Yeah, exactly. And, so I think part of that is going to be, trying to figure out, are there easy ways that we can communicate these things to them in a very simple manner? As well as, are there specific things that we need to be stating to help them make their legal cases? Is there some rubric that we need to be defining? Those are things that we can discuss. So it sounds like short term, you really want to support kind of some of the cases that are already in the courts and new cases that may be coming up. But after that, supporting the activists, that may be legislation or that may be lawsuits, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So yes, that's correct. The way I would put it right now is that there are some pretty clear culprits in the current redistricting cycle, which because of how slow lawsuits are, we're actually nearing the end of the cycle. But there are cases proceeding through Wisconsin, North Carolina, Maryland. These are hot cases, and in the community of lawyers who are advocating for reforms, all eyes are on these 3 cases that I just listed. Pretty close behind them are cases in Texas, Virginia. I can't remember the status of Florida right now. So lawyers and litigants know where the bodies are buried, and that's up front. General question is how to tutor people. I think that anyone who's listening to this conversation, maps seem like an obvious way to deal with it, but there's actually a big caveat there, which is that maps are not actually at the level of the Supreme Court enough to persuade them. There's been a lot of effort there. So I think maps can be a good visualization tool, but whatever we present has to go beyond maps. And so I'm just mentioning it because to this community of coders, maps are the obvious way in, but I think they're mainly to help people navigate as opposed to proving the point, which is a kind of a fine distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think taking some of the models that you already have, doing some of what we talked about, porting it to Python, and then creating not only, kind of the write-up that you already have, but also maybe increasing the number of visualizations that we have, not just maps, but other forms of visualizations to really help, the lawyers and judges understand kind of the text as well.
Yeah, I think that if you look at what's set up in the initial somewhat rickety version that's at gerrymander.princeton.edu now, it's kind of static. It's got kind of clunky Web 1.0 data entry. And so there are ways to turn that into something a little bit more interactive, to put in a slider bar, to have ways of making it pop a little bit more, and use the fact that I'm a neuroscientist, and I know that we are visual animals. And so to come up with a way to really take advantage of the fact that we are visual animals and just really get in people's heads, get in their visual cortex, get in their, take the short way in to appeal to them. And so, yeah, so I think that over here at Princeton, Brian and I are working on understanding the statistical properties of the standards more. That's a big analysis that we're doing. And then there's a question of how to take what we find and turn that into something that's as direct a pipeline as possible into the mental space of lawyers and judges.
That sounds fantastic. I guess one of my kind of following on from that statement, the work that you and Brian are doing there at Princeton, is there any interest in, our group, we definitely have some web development skills, but we're also, we're a group of data scientists, basically.
Oh, mm-hmm.
And we love the actual modeling work. So is there any room for helping you guys on some of that more computationally intensive stuff?
There could be. The closest thing we have to simulations is a branch of this project that goes to simulating many, many maps. We've kept
Mm-hmm.
off of that a little bit just because it's a pretty time-intensive project. There's a researcher in Illinois, Wendy Tam Cho, who's done a bang-up job on supercomputer-based approaches, and she is able to simulate 1 billion maps in half an hour.
Wow.
So that's good. So that, I think, and that is a route to this longer-term thing with activists who would like to say write legislation, because what she can do is game out the consequences of rules and see how those rules would lead to fairness or lack of fairness. And so I think that is an interesting project. I hesitate because there is a question of how one could possibly do that on a volunteer or distributed basis. It has the vibe of wanting a full-time scholar to work on it. So I think that plenty of people on this call have the smarts to do it, but there is the question of having the time to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. Do you have more thoughts on this, Brian?
Yeah, so along the same lines, we have the models that Sam has come up with and we're working on. There are also a bunch of other standards out there to look at how you can identify gerrymander. And one thing that we've been discussing is it's very difficult to prove that standards work, basically. It's impossible to prove a negative. So something that could be really cool if people are interested in it is examining different standards and trying to find maps that game the standards. And maps here doesn't mean GIS necessarily. It means any sort of, but
right. So it can either be using redistricting software or drawing maps, or it can be just hypothetical ways to game the standard. Because there are a bunch of standards that have been offered up. Most of them seem pretty good. They're offered up by me. I'm not a political scientist. And then there are people who are card-carrying political scientists who have their own standards. And the question is, can one find a flaw in the argument? And at some level, the collective intelligence of you guys, it's basically a game to see whether you can fool us. And if that is the case, then we better not use that standard.
Yeah.
And this gets back, this is sort of a version of what I was saying about what to write into rules. And so basically, if one can find a flaw in a standard, we better not use that standard.
Yeah, I think that would be a great way for us to help with collaboration. It's kind of crowdsourcing the expertise on trying to break a standard. I think that works really well for a volunteer type group.
Yeah.
And we're starting to kind of get into this, doing these hackathons like we had last week, and that would be a really cool project to try to get a bunch of people together to break a few standards.
Yeah.
So I like that.
That'd be fun. Actually,
yeah, it'd be a ton of fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so that sounds great. Next steps, we're starting to work on putting a plan together to actually start updating the website, and we'll communicate with both you, Sam, and Brian, just to make sure that we're kind of following what you want, obviously, and also let's talk a little. What are you thinking, given that some of these court cases are coming up? Obviously you do have a website up there, so there's something there. But what is a good timeline for you to get a new website up?
It would be fantastic to have something up. I would say let's see, we're in April now. I would say to have something functional in maybe June or July would be fantastic.
Okay.
If you think about the thing as an information resource, there are certain minimum functionality that would be important, which is tutoring people with articles and links to key information. I mean, this is, simple setting up of a site. And then there's coming up with some kind of representation to implement the standards that we have. So one thing is just sort of serving up links and maybe a blog. I mean, like simple website establishment. And another thing would be what we were talking about at the beginning of this call, finding ways to visualize and to present information in a convenient manner. I think probably anything would probably have to have some kind of map representation just because people are visual. And so I don't know, ballpark, what would be a realistic time to have something live?
Honestly, I wanted to just get your thoughts. We're still getting the team together right now. So off the top of my head, that seems reasonable, but let's get a little bit more into the planning and make sure that, that June, July timeframe works. But yeah, off the cuff, it seems reasonable.
And let me just give you some specifics. So the specifics are that, for instance, I'm working on at least one amicus brief, which is a friend of the court brief, and that's got to be into the Supreme Court by August 1st. And so in order to have them point at something, it would be helpful to have something live by then. Another would be, in the case of gaming these standards, the cycle for law review, law journal article submissions is also around August 1st. And so, for instance, any kind of hacking of standards, it would be great to do it well before then so that we could write something about that. So there are several things that converge starting in August. And so there are good reasons to get things in place by then in order to make sure that people who are interested in the topic have someplace to land.
That is a perfect thing to know right there. So August 1st, we'll be shooting to have those as kind of all of our end goals. And obviously, if it's things like hacking the standards where you guys need to have time to actually write as well, we can focus on giving that lead time as well.
And that allows the possibility of having something viable or viable looking, as they say, not quite vaporware, but a demo version of where Steve Jobs can say, no, we're going to do this. Don't click that. Okay, so some version that's show offable in the June, July timeframe, and then clean it up by August.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's enough, kind of steam behind this, not only in our group, but also, the other group that you put me in touch with, and there's another group here in DC that has some interest that I'm going to talk to as well. So I think we'll be able to get a good group of people together. I want to make it big, but I want to keep it small enough that we can actually run this thing well. So it seems reasonable.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think that anyone who's interested is welcome to look at my Stanford Law Review article and also to poke around gerrymander.princeton.edu and see what there is there. Warts and all, a fair amount of the content is there. So people are welcome to look at it. It's currently in Python and MATLAB. I understand that Python partisans are going to go at the MATLAB, but I run a lab, and so we control equipment with MATLAB. That's just how we've been for the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Sam and Brian, and we look forward to the collaboration.
Pleasure talking to you.